Welcome to Teachers Talk Money, where a millennial high school teacher and a Gen X elementary teacher get together to talk all things money.
From salary scales to saving, investing, and self-care, we're here to help teachers master their money. I'm Christy.
And I'm Rachel, and we're so glad you're here. Hey, Christy.
Hey, Rachel. How's it going?
Good. How are you? Any updates this week?
Yeah, I had a great week, and we are approaching the end of a month. And I just have to say that when COVID hit, I fell off the budgeting train, and I was not nearly as careful with tracking my finances because I had no time because I had another family emergency that happened, and I'm back on it. And this is perfectly appropriate for this episode because I'm loving it. It is so refreshing and just nice to know that I've got everything back in order. So that's kind of my news.
That is so fitting, and I totally agree with you. I feel like I am much less stressed out when I have my budget on lock than I would be otherwise.
Yeah, and I think it's also good to say that as we get into this episode, and we're going to talk about it, but budgeting is not a perfect exact science every single season of your life. There's going to be times when it works really well for you and times when it has to take a back seat. And so I'm in the front seat again.
I love that. I love it.
How about you? How was your week?
So it was really good. One of the best things to happen this week is that I finally got in contact with somebody from Human Resources in my district and got all of my questions about how our salary scale is working in my district answered. And I made a tentative plan to reach the highest lane ASAP. So really excited to start doing that. I'm finishing up a certificate program right now, so it's going to take some more time. I'm going to need to invest a little bit of money in it. But I was mostly pleasantly surprised in all of the information that I learned. So I'm really, really excited to do that. Because while we are going to talk about budgeting today, which is really step number one, and one of the most important things you can do for your money management, there's also the other side to that, which is that, when you earn more, you've got a lot more money to work with, and it just naturally makes things easier. But you sort of have to do both because there are lots of high earners who don't budget that are in debt or aren't really reaching their goals as fast as they could be. So what are we going to talk about today?
Well, I wanted to start out with, I taught first and second grade for a very long time and now just teach second grade, but first graders in particular are very, 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 very into bad words. Like it's their first experience with them and they start to kind of identify them. And sometimes one of them would come up to you and say, Mrs. Muir, Tommy said the S word. And you have to go like, okay, what's the S word? And they'll go, shut up. And so it just is so funny to always hear what they identify as bad words. And so when we were thinking of this episode, we were thinking, ooh, it's the B word. And then the idea that bad words can be relative. So for first graders, saying shut up is a terrible thing to say. And for other people, maybe it's not so bad. But we wanted to say that budgeting tends to get this sort of bad rap and becomes a bad word, and it doesn't have to. And so for us, the B word is a good word. And we're excited to be here to share with you whether you're an old pro at budgeting and you already have a plan that works for you. We're hoping we can give you some tips and tricks to kind of refine things or frame things in a way that works even better. And if you're brand new to this, then we're hoping to help you kind of build those first steps for yourself.
Totally. And I love that you bring up that it's sort of like this bad word. And it started out definitely in my life as a bad word too. Like I believed that a budget was like, if you were tight on money for some reason, or maybe you'd have something like a wedding budget or like some sort of budget for an upcoming expense. But I didn't think it was something that everybody needed to have each and every month. And I definitely thought it was something that had to be restrictive and focused on cutting costs. And that is just not true at all and not how it has worked in my life at all. It has actually been much more freeing and helped me reach my goals. And it's really just been a roadmap to those goals and something that's been way more liberating than restrictive in any sense of the word. And I think that you've had a similar experience with that.
Yeah, our budget is really the key that helped us pay off that $110,000 in student loan debt. It was the roadmap and the plan that we used that accessed all of the potential that was hiding in our meager funds at that point. So I like to think of it also in terms of a lesson plan. I mean, we're all teachers and we know what it's like to show up in front of a class of kids either well prepared or unprepared. I mean, I have certainly had those days where I don't have a lesson plan, I don't have my materials prepped all the way. I'm not sure even maybe about what my objectives are. And I know that that's going to be really stressful for me. I'm going to be anxious going into it, and the kids are not going to learn as much as they can. And then we all know that in the classroom, surely a giant spider will crawl out from under a book, or someone will be sick to their stomach, or, the admin walks into the room, and then it becomes even more anxious because you're not ready for those unexpected events. So I like to think of budgeting kind of in the same way, right?
Yeah, it's so true because, and similarly to the classroom analogy, I mean, I'm sure we've all gone in without set in stone, rock solid plans, or even plans that we came up with that morning or the night before, or whatever that procrastination looks like for you. And it still works, right? Like you might be saying, well, I don't need a budget. I've lived my life up until this point. I'm doing okay. And that's okay. Like I've gone in and planned a lesson the morning of and it went fine. Things happened. Kids learned, but it wasn't as amazing as it could be. And it really wasn't helping me reach my goal. And the budget is the same thing. And I love, Christy, that you brought up the fact that even when bumps come up, when you've got that plan in place, it makes it so much easier to still reach those goals with all of the unexpected things that could happen and surely will happen, both in the classroom and with your money, for sure.
Well, and yeah, that just reminded me of how I started this episode. 2020 was a huge bump for me. I mean, so many things happened in addition to COVID in my life that just felt out of control. And it was also really great to have that plan to come back to, even though couldn't be as attentive to my budget during that time. I knew it was there and guiding me nonetheless. And then it was easy to step back into it full steam once I had some more just emotional and mental space for it. And so I think that is such a great point, that it's there and you can either be super engaged with it or it can be your guide. And either way, it's a framework that can help support your goals.
That's so true. And I really like that point too, because when you've been budgeting for a while, you do start to internalize a lot of the important numbers that you need to look out for.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you do get so super overwhelmed and need to take a break from it, you still at least have internalized some of that. So you're not going to go and screw up your finances if you need to just take a step back for a little bit.
Exactly. And that kind of leads into why we want to have a budget. It just brings so much more consciousness and awareness and control and empowerment with your money. It really puts you in the driver's seat and lets you know exactly what you're working with. And for me, budgeting just naturally makes me way more conscious of what I spend, but in a really, really good way, not in the way where you were bringing up that some people think of it as like, oh, I just feel guilt and I can't do this and I can't do that. But for me, I'm paying attention to what I'm spending on. And so I know I'm spending on things that I want and that I need and that matter to me. And then I catch myself saying, do I really want that? Do I really want to go and write that on the budget in in my spreadsheet? Nah. And so it helps me save more just by knowing what my goals are and knowing what matters to me and what I'm focused on.
Absolutely. I have never reached a goal by accident. I don't know if you have, Christy.
Right.
But all of my goals that I have been able to achieve, I've set that intention and I've made a plan. And so many of our important life goals are at least intertwined with money or related to money in some way. And so you really need to make a plan for your money, because even if you're not thinking about your goals as like quote unquote money goals or financial goals, chances are money and finance have to do with those big goals as well.
Right.
And so it's so important to have a plan, because you don't just reach big, audacious, awesome goals by accident. You need to create a pathway, and your budget is your plan to do that.
Absolutely. And so think about why you're budgeting. If you haven't been budgeting and you want to start, you can't just start because we're telling you to or because you think you should, because then you're not going to have that buy-in and it won't last. So whether you have a budget already or you're thinking about starting one, knowing your why and knowing why it matters to you is critical, because just like any other changes we've tried to make in our lives, whether it's health habits or eating habits, it's got to be meaningful if it's going to work for you. You can't just do it because someone else is telling you should.
Yeah, and I think an important note about what is meaningful to you or what your goals are is that you really need to dig deep to kind of figure out exactly what they are. So I like to think of this similarly to stuff that applies to education as backwards mapping, right? So if you're backwards mapping a task that you have to do in the curriculum, you write the date that you want it done by, and then you look at all the weeks leading up to that and say, what are the most important skills for me to cover to get us to that point? And that is the exact same thing with budgeting. And a lot of people will say, my goal is to pay off all my debt, or my goal is to start investing, or my goal is to save more. And I think that's an okay place to start. Like, those are all really valid and really great goals.
Mm-hmm.
But I want you to dig a little bit deeper and consider why those things are your goals. Because when you get to that really specific reason, that really big, audacious goal, then you'll have even more motivation than just saying, well, I want to get my debt to zero. So for example, maybe your audacious goal is to pay your kids' college. Maybe it's to retire early or move to a part-time schedule for a while, or be able to take summers off, or just to let go of money shame, or to take amazing vacations every summer. Think about those really specific things that matter to you, because that is going to be so much more meaningful than just saying, I want to save more.
Absolutely. It makes me think of SMART goals, right? They have to be measurable. They have to be tangible. They have to be things we can work towards. And so the more specific you can make your goal and tie your budget to that, the more clearly lined out that path is going to become for you, and the more progress you're going to make towards that goal. And don't freak out if your budget isn't perfect at first. I know that's what slows a lot of people down from starting, is they think, oh, it's going to be so much work and it's going to be so many moving parts to try and manage. And that's right. It is a lot of moving parts at first, and it's probably not going to be perfect, but it's yours. You make it exactly what you want to make it. So there's no failing at this. There's only refining. Nothing is set in stone, and it might change every month as you remember, oh, this is the month when I have to pay my sewer bill, for example, and that's $90 and I didn't have that budgeted. And so it takes a while to really learn the ins and outs of your spending habits and those unexpected costs. But if you give yourself that grace and say, this is a work in progress, that's what's going to keep moving you forward.
Totally. And I love that you talk about how it's really specific to what each individual person wants, because I know that you and I, Christy, budget so differently. Like, I am like to the dollar on it, and I'm really focused in on it. And you have a more loose idea at this point in your journey, because you have reached a lot of those baseline goals, with your debt and things like that. It really doesn't matter exactly what it looks like, but it has to be something that's going to work for you. And you have to know what is coming in and where that money is going.
And so if we jump into the steps that it takes, we want to let you know first that we have designed our own budget templates. They're free on our websites, teacherstalkmoney.com, financiallyfitteacher.com. And those might be a great starting point for you, because you can take what we've made and tailor them exactly to your expenses and your income and your needs. And for 15 years, honestly, we just had a 3-ring binder, and it was purple. And we just called it the purple book. And we would write everything down in the purple book, and it was paper and pencil, and it was so simple. So you can have like super fancy, beautiful, like Pinterest worthy budgets. And if you Google it, there are a million free ones out there. Don't reinvent the wheel. Or you can literally just have a list on a piece of paper that, grows into having all the parts and pieces that you need.
So let's talk about the steps of creating a budget, because even if you go and get a template from one of our websites or from Google, or you want to do this on pen and paper, you still need to know what steps to take. And these steps are the same for basically every style of budgeting. It might just be organized a little bit differently. But I basically came up with the 5 steps, the most simple, filtered down steps that you need to create a working budget. And I like this because I want to create a way to do this that has the least friction possible, because obviously we don't have an abundance of free time as teachers. And also, I don't want anyone to get demotivated or derailed in the process of getting started doing this, because the most important thing is to start. And like you said, Christy, you just readjust and reevaluate from there. So let's get started with step one. The very first thing you need to do to create your budget is that you need to know what money is coming in. In order to determine this, you need to check your pay stubs or your bank account if you don't already know the exact numbers. And then from there, you are going to start with your fixed expenses. So these are all of the expenses that are exactly the same every month. This would be like your rent or mortgage payment, bills that are always the same. Maybe some of your utilities are exactly $20 a month or whatever it is. Any subscriptions, any debt repayment minimums. Find these in your bank account or your credit card statements. And some of them you may have memorized. You may just know. And these are a great starting place because these numbers are already clear and known, and there's no guessing or estimating for this part.
And for those of you that might have just cringed when you heard Rachel say credit card statement, I definitely put every single thing on a credit card that I can because I earn rewards. And we both just say we fully support paying off your credit card in full on time every month. And we're not recommending that you build up a credit card balance, although we all know sometimes that happens. But I do use my credit card as my main budgeting tool. I haven't looked at a bank statement and I don't even remember when because it's all on an app on my phone linked to the card that I'm using at the time. And so it's really easy to know what I'm spending and where it's going. And then my bank just takes the statement balance out every time it's due.
And I'm glad you said that because when I talk about a credit card statement, I basically use it as an interim checking account just to get the rewards, and I completely pay it off every month. And I don't want you to be using a credit card if that's something that you're already in a lot of consumer debt from.
So step 3, you need to know your variable expenses. And these are things like groceries, gas, dining out, clothing, utilities if those change. And that's going to vary for every person, depending on your family size, depending on the things you like to spend money on. So that's where you have to tailor it to what works for you. For me, the way I started was just tracking our spending for 1 month to know what I was working with. How much were we already spending on groceries? How much were we already spending on those variable expenses? And using that as a benchmark to then say, okay, do I want to increase that a little? Or do I want to dial that back a little? Is that really what I want to be spending on those variable expenses?
Absolutely. And I use a slightly different method because I just want to encourage people to get started right away without feeling like, oh, I can't make my first budget until I track my spending for a month. And then, if you forget to track your spending for part of the month, then you're like, I guess I can't start my budget. So I like to advise people to set the budget first and just guess what your variable expenses will be. Just estimate, I think I spend maybe $300 a month on groceries or whatever it is. And then as you track that month after you've set the budget, just readjust those. So if the total doesn't end up being even close to what you estimated, then readjust those variable totals accordingly.
I love that too, Rachel, because if you think you spend $300 a month on food and you're actually spending $500 or $600, that could be like a huge part of that awareness and intentionality that starts with a budget when you're going, holy crap, I had no idea I was spending that much money on a category. And then you can say, oh, well, that's fine because that's what I need to get by. Or maybe I can dial that back and save $200 that I didn't even know I was spending, and it's so fun to hear about how people discover that they're spending more money than they thought or less money than they thought. And you can't do that unless you're paying attention. Thinking about the next step, you've got your income, your fixed expenses, your variable expenses, and then you're going to have what's left over. After you have bought and paid for all the things you need to get through your month, hopefully you have something left over. And that is where you're going to be building up your savings and investing. And in some cases, saving and investing are the same thing because you're investing to save for retirement. But we want to know what our intermittent expenses are. And so you're saving for things that you're not paying every month, but that come maybe once or twice a year or quarterly. Again, it might be like oil changes in your car or my sewer bill that I mentioned or a haircut. I get my haircut 3 times a year. And you don't want those intermittent expenses to blow your budget for the month and not allow you the money you need to spend on all the other things we just talked about. And Rachel, you have a really great system that you use. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I call these sinking funds, and they're commonly known as sinking funds. I'm not exactly sure where that terminology comes from or what exactly it means, but it's another way of thinking about savings accounts that are for midterm expenses. So things that come up not every month, they're irregular, so they're not like your fixed expenses. But in general, you should be saving for them monthly and therefore be able to pay them when they come up. So for me, I don't travel every single month, but every single month I put a certain amount of money into my travel fund so that when summer comes along or spring break or whatever the next trip I'm planning is, I have the money there to use. I also have a sinking fund for my summer savings because I only get paid over 10 months. So I need to set aside a little bit each month in order to live over the summer without having to work. I have a sinking fund for my grad school tuition, for gifts for Christmas because I have a really big family, so I need to be saving for that every year, and for car repairs and car replacement, because all of these things I'm expecting to happen, but they're not happening regularly. So I need to be putting aside savings for those.
Yeah, I totally think they should be called building funds. I don't know why they're called sinking funds, but either way, they're an awesome idea. And Rachel, do you have separate accounts for each of those things you just named, or do you kind of just allocate money within one account for those purposes?
I'm so glad you asked that. And we could do an entire episode on this, so I won't get too deep into it. But I have separate accounts for every single one. And I highly recommend that this is what people do, because I've seen so many people get lost and confused thinking, I have all these savings, but I don't know what they're there for because they have not separated the accounts. And so while it's a little bit of more upfront work, and maybe you don't have to do this the first month that you're trying budgeting or anything, just consider the fact that you should be separating those eventually, because A, you get to see exactly what's allocated for each thing, and you're not dipping too far into your emergency savings because you wanted to pay more for a trip or something like that. Like, it just gets really hairy if you have it all lumped together, and it doesn't really show you what actual progress you're making towards your goals. Some people swear that they can just have one savings account and it's totally fine and they know what's in there for what. And if that's you, that's you. And I'm not going to take that away from you. But I've seen so many people get tripped up on this. So it's my belief that in general, much better to separate them. And then you can name them fun things. Like your travel fund can be like Italy 2023. And then you're so much more motivated to save for it.
And I think it also cracks people up at the bank too when they're hearing funny names of savings accounts that you can come up with.
Yes.
So in addition to your sinking funds, you should be saving towards a fully funded emergency fund, which we are going to get to in the next episode, but just file that away. And then Rachel, what about investing?
Yeah, so obviously we don't have time to talk about investing in our budgeting episode, but for step 4, we are considering all of this money after you cover your basic fixed and variable expenses as what you have to save or invest. So we're going to be getting into all of that good stuff in future episodes, and probably multiple episodes, because obviously it's a big, big topic.
Yeah, investing is one of my most very favorite things to talk about. I love it. And I want to just say to people, the budget can help you with this simple formula of earn more, spend less, and invest the difference. If you don't have money left over right now for investing towards retirement savings, that is one of the most key things your budget can help you with, because it can maybe help you take out some of those things that aren't as important to you as retirement and have a gap there, have some leftovers. That's where you're going to find it, is by doing a budget where you can be very conscious and intentional about things. And you'll go, oh my gosh, now I have an extra $50 a month, or I have an extra $100 a month. And that's where you can start with that investing piece. And of course, the other thing you can do with that gap when you find one or create one is to take that extra money and put it towards your debt payoff. If you have some debt that you're working on chipping away at and getting down to zero. And the idea would be just to find that extra money, make that gap, and then take that money and put it towards saving for retirement, debt payoff, or a little bit of both. And we'll get into the nuances of that in future episodes, but the focus right now is just really trying to find that little bit extra that you can put to work for yourself.
Yeah, and I will say that sometimes the budget can highlight a spending problem. Like if you don't have a gap, maybe the problem is that you really just should decrease your discretionary spending. But a lot of times, if the budget is feeling restrictive or you're not able to see a big enough gap for what you want to set aside for savings or investments, that will typically highlight actually an income issue versus a spending issue. Obviously, it depends on the person. But like I said, your budget shouldn't feel restrictive. And if you're on top of things and it does feel restrictive, then you may have an income problem instead of a spending problem.
Teachers with an income problem? What are you talking about, Rachel?
Unheard of.
Who's ever heard of such a thing? And then that goes back to, how can we increase our income, which definitely we have a path to do that. So looking on to step 5, then once you have all of these expenses and savings goals, you just need a way to keep track of what you spend in each category. You could do this every day. You could do it every week. You could do it every month. I honestly have done all of the above. Now that I use a spreadsheet and I have the internet at my house, thank you, COVID. I do this every day. I just bring home the receipt and I enter it in the spreadsheet and it's done. It takes 10 seconds. In the past, when we had the purple book, we just had a little box where we put all of our receipts. And every other week or so, I would sit down and just write down all those receipts and add them up. You can use, like we said before, your bank statement or your credit card statement as well. Any way that's easy for you, that's not going to have a lot of barriers, is what you need to find. I mean, for me, I just have a desktop shortcut to my budget template. So it's like even 2 fewer clicks to get to it. It's just click, enter the amount, move on with my life. There are also some budgeting apps that are wildly popular. Mint is one that is free, and You Need a Budget, or YNAB, is $80 a year, I believe. I personally don't like either one of them because I find them to be more work, and they don't categorize things the way I want them categorized. However, there are literally like Facebook groups full of people who YNAB all day long. And I know my sister uses Mint and absolutely loves it. So if you're looking for an app, there are some really great tools out there.
I'm so glad you said that because I also don't like the apps that are really available because I prefer so much more customization for me so I can make it as simple as possible and make the most sense to me as possible. So if that sounds like you can give the apps a try, and I would never discourage anybody from that because it might make your life easier. But if you find that that's not working, don't just say, oh, well, I guess budgeting doesn't work for me. That's honestly what I did when I first started using Mint. I was like, I guess I can't do this because it's telling me I'm going over budget and everything. And that wasn't the case at all. So just don't get discouraged if you try one type of system and that doesn't end up working for you. That doesn't mean that budgeting won't work for you. It just means you need to find a better tool. Maybe that is DIYing your own spreadsheet or DIYing your own little budget journal with pen and paper. But don't necessarily reinvent the wheel. Like we talked about before, we've got budget templates on both of our websites. Christy's is financiallyfitteacher.com and mine is teacherstalkmoney.com. So you can use one of ours if you seem to sort of jive with the way that we're talking about these things.
Yeah, and I love that idea, Rachel, of not giving up if at first you don't succeed. Then that again brings me back to being a teacher, right? I mean, what do we do with our kids if we try to teach them how to add 2-digit numbers with a new group of 10 and it falls flat the first time and the kid doesn't get it? We don't let the kid say, well, I don't understand how to do math. We say, okay, I got to try and teach this kid in a different way because that first approach didn't fit that kiddo. And so that's what we have to do, allow ourselves to, and say, if this way doesn't work, I'm going to keep trying if it's something that matters to you and that you want to do. One of the most favorite things that my husband says to me is don't overthink it, because I tend to overthink things. And he's always like, don't overthink it. Just do it. Just let it go. Just go. And so that's what we really want to leave you guys with, is some thoughts about, first of all, don't overthink it. You can easily overwhelm your brain thinking about all the money you spend across a year and all the categories. Just pick a starting point, pick a piece of paper, track today's spending, and then start working on what you expect that to be for the month in just the main categories even, and just start a little bit at a time wherever it makes the most sense for you.
Yeah, and remember that this is one of the greatest opportunities you have to reach your audacious goals that might seem so far away or out of reach. I can't tell you how many teachers are surprised by the fact that I'm going to be able to retire early. And it's not a matter of me living my life that much differently than they are. It's just a matter of having the intention and creating a plan and then following that plan.
Absolutely. I mean, budgeting can bring a whole new level of awareness and intention about your money into your life. And for me, budgeting really made money my friend for the first time. It's what transitioned it, not overnight, but it transitioned it from being something really scary to something that was an ally. And I just think it's so important that people be able to get a hold of it in a way that makes sense for them.
So to recap the 5 simple steps to budgeting, step 1 is that you need to know your income. So you need to know what money is coming in first.
Step 2, you need to know your fixed expenses. What are you spending every month? That's the same amount.
Step 3, you need to know your variable expenses. So this may mean that you're tracking your spending for a month before starting, or that you are setting guesstimates and then adjusting along the way.
And then step 4 is with what's left over, you're building up your sinking funds and setting some money aside to invest for your future.
And finally, step 5, which is really the ongoing part of this process, is that you are going to track your spending each and every month to see if you're meeting the numbers that you set for your budget.
So teachers listening to us and wanting to start a budget or revamp their budget or re-energize your budgeting process, think of Rachel and I as your budgeting cheerleaders. I can pull a really, really good cartwheel, and I will do one for you. Rachel, what do you have in your bag of tricks?
Great question. I have nothing in my bag of tricks. My high kick is about 2 feet high. I cannot straighten my leg past my waist or even really before the point of my waist. So as the least flexible person that I know, I will not be doing any cheerleading moves. However, I'm extremely uplifting and encouraging. And so I make up for it with my attitude.
I mean, I personally like the mental image of you doing a very ungraceful high kick, so I might use that, whether you like it or not. Okay. All right, everybody. Have a really great week, and we can't wait to talk to you again soon.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us here on Teachers Talk Money.
Subscribe now to make sure you don't miss a future episode.
Leave us a review of this podcast. It helps more teachers find us.
Share it with a teacher friend who can use some of this information.
You can find more money advice from Christy at Financially Fit Teacher on Instagram and Rachel at Teachers Talk Money on Instagram and YouTube.
All opinions are our own, and our awesome theme music is by John Bartman.